In the winter of 1947, on a grey pier at the Norfolk Naval Operating Base in Virginia, a young cargo clerk, named nothing in any surviving public record, sat behind a folding table with a clipboard, a rubber stamp, and a stack of manifest forms that would, decades later, become the subject of quiet argument among archivists who could never agree on what they were looking at. He was not a sailor. He was not an officer. He was a civilian employee of the Navy's Logistics Division, one of hundreds of clerks assigned to process the returning cargo of Operation High Jump, the largest Antarctic expedition the United States had ever mounted, under the command of Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd. His job, on paper, was simple. Ships would return from the ice. Crates would come off those ships. Each crate would be opened, inspected, weighed, and logged. Each entry would receive a case number, a content description, and a signature. It was the signature that would trouble him for the rest of his life, because there were 11 crates arriving in the last week of February 1947 that he was ordered to log without opening them, and to describe using a single approved phrase that meant, in practice, nothing at all. Scientific apparatus, non-hazardous, origin unspecified. This is the story of those 11 crates, the clerk who logged them, and the 60 years of silence that followed, pieced together from surviving fragments of Navy cargo procedure, newspaper coverage of Operation High Jump's abrupt conclusion, Byrd's own public statements in the weeks after his return, and a small, water-damaged notebook that surfaced in an estate sale in 2004, attributed by the family who sold it to a relative who had, they said, worked the docks during the war and after. The operation that came home. Early Operation High Jump began in the final months of 1946 as, by every public account, the largest polar expedition in history. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, over 4,000 men. The stated purpose, according to the Navy's own press releases at the time, was to establish the feasibility of maintaining bases in polar conditions, to test equipment and personnel in extreme cold, to expand American territorial claims in Antarctica, and to conduct extensive aerial mapping of a continent that remained, in 1946, the least surveyed landmass on Earth. Byrd, already a national hero from his earlier polar flights of the 1920s, was placed in command of the operation's exploratory and development side, working under the overall command of Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen. The expedition was expected, by its own planning documents, to last 6 to 8 months, through the Antarctic summer of 1947. Instead, it was terminated, and the fleet recalled in late February 1947, barely 8 weeks after the main task force had arrived at the ice. The public explanation, delivered through Navy channels and printed without much elaboration in newspapers across the country, cited the early onset of the Antarctic winter and difficult ice conditions that made continued operations unsafe. This explanation was technically true. It was also, according to several officers who later gave interviews or wrote memoirs about their service, incomplete. Weather in the region that season had been difficult, but not unprecedented. Several junior officers noted, in accounts given years afterward, that the abruptness of the recall, coming as a single order rather than a phased withdrawal, struck them as unusual for an operation of that scale and cost. What is not disputed is this: the fleet came home early, it came home fast, and it came home carrying more than it had left with. 2. The pier, the winter, and the clerk. The USS Mount Olympus, task force flagship, along with several support vessels, arrived at Norfolk and other East Coast ports in the final week of February and first week of March 1947. Cargo processing, for a fleet of this size, was not a small undertaking. Standard Navy procedure required that all non-personnel cargo, equipment, scientific samples, salvage, specimens, photographic material, damaged gear being returned for repair or disposal, pass through a logging process before it could be released to its designated custody, whether that custody was a laboratory, a supply depot, a private contractor, or a research institution. The clerk at the center of this account, referred to in the surviving notebook only by the initials W.H., a detail the family who later sold the notebook could neither confirm nor deny belonged to their relative, was, according to his own later writing, 26 years old in 1947, a former enlisted man who had been kept on in a civilian capacity after his discharge because of his handwriting and his patience with paperwork. He had processed hundreds of crates in the 2 years prior, from returning Pacific Theatre salvage to routine equipment transfers. He described the work, in his own words preserved in the notebook, as dull, and I did not mind dull. Dull did not follow you home. That changed, by his account, on the third day of unloading from the Mount Olympus. The scale of the unloading itself is worth dwelling on, because it explains why a handful of irregular crates could pass through the system largely unremarked by anyone except the one clerk assigned to process them. Task Force 68, as High Jump's returning fleet was designated, brought back not only the expedition's own equipment, but salvage from a crash that had killed 3 men during the operation: meteorological instruments, ice core samples, photographic negatives numbering in the tens of thousands, spare aircraft parts too damaged for further use, and the ordinary accumulated freight of any large naval deployment: spare uniforms, broken radios, crates of ration tins nobody had gotten around to eating. But against this volume, 11 crates, moved quickly and quietly through one Clerk station on one afternoon among many, were not the kind of anomaly that would draw attention from anyone not directly responsible for logging them. That, according to researchers who have since examined the surviving fragments of this story, may well have been the point. A conspicuous operation invites conspicuous questions. A small, procedurally boring irregularity buried inside an operation moving thousands of tons of ordinary cargo invites almost none. The Clerk station itself was little more than a card table set up near the base of the gangway, sheltered from the worst of the Virginia winter wind by a canvas tarp strung between 2 posts. He worked 12-hour shifts during the peak unloading days, according to his notebook, processing what he estimated at 60 to 80 individual case entries per shift. He kept his own carbon copies of completed forms in a satchel, a habit he had developed not out of any suspicion, but simply because, as he wrote, paperwork has a way of walking off a dock, and a man who cannot produce his own record when someone asks for it later is a man in trouble, whether or not he did anything wrong. It was this habit, ordinary and defensive rather than investigative, that preserved the only trace of the 11 case numbers after Commodore collected the originals. The form that came from above cargo manifests in this period followed a standardized Navy form requiring the clerk to record a case number, point of embarkation, a physical description of contents based on direct visual inspection, gross weight, any hazard classifications, and the officer of record authorizing release. The process assumed, structurally, that the clerk would open the crate. This was not optional in ordinary practice. A sealed crate could not be legally logged as safe for transport or storage without a documented inspection, both for insurance purposes and for basic safety, given that damaged batteries, unstable chemical samples, or compressed gas containers from a polar expedition were a real and known risk. According to the notebook, on that third day, a lieutenant commander, whose name the clerk recorded only as Commodore R, approached his station personally, which the clerk noted was itself unusual. Cargo officers rarely dealt directly with logging clerks, delegating that liaison to a petty officer. Commodore R presented the clerk with a supplementary requisition slip, already signed, instructing that a specific block of case numbers, 11 in total, numbered sequentially but pulled from a larger batch rather than grouped together on the ship's original loading manifest, be logged using a standard boilerplate description without physical inspection. The clerk wrote, in an entry his family transcribed and later shared with researchers examining the notebook, "I told the commander I could not sign a form for a crate I had not opened. He said the crate had already been opened, by others, at a level I did not have clearance to know about, and that my job was only to complete the paper trail so the crate could be moved off Navy property." He said this in a friendly way. He was not unfriendly at any point, but he stood at my table until I had filled in all 11 forms, and he took the completed forms with him, rather than leaving them in my outgoing tray, as was the normal practice. What the forms did say: even without physical inspection, cargo procedure required certain fields to be filled based on information available to the clerk, namely gross weight, as recorded by the crane operators and dock workers who physically moved each crate from ship to pier, and dimensions, taken by whichever loading team handled the transfer. These figures were not classified. They were mechanical facts recorded by ordinary sailors doing ordinary work, and several of those figures survive in the clerk's private notebook, apparently copied by hand from the forms before Comdara collected them. The 11 crates ranged in weight from approximately 400 pounds to just over 2,000 pounds for the heaviest of the group. Dimensions on several were unusually irregular for standard scientific equipment crating of the period. Navy shipping crates for instruments and samples typically followed modular sizing to fit efficiently into cargo holds, but 3 of the 11, according to the notebook's copied figures, were built to non-standard dimensions, one of them long and narrow, in a way the clerk himself, off the record, compared in his notebook to a coffin, before adding, in the same entry, "I do not say this to be dramatic. I say it because it was the shape, and because dock workers said the same thing among themselves, and one of them made a joke about it, that nobody laughed at." The point of embarkation field, meant to record which specific location the cargo had been loaded from during the expedition, was left blank on all 11 forms in the original requisition, and the clerk wrote that he was instructed to fill it with the general expedition designation, rather than a specific base or ship coordinate, which he noted was contrary to standard practice, since even ordinary equipment crates carried specific loading coordinates for later reference. V. The destination, and who signed for it. Every logged crate required a receiving custody signature, the person or institution authorized to take possession once the crate left Navy processing. For ordinary scientific samples from a polar expedition, this was frequently a research institution, a university geology department, a national research bureau, or in several documented cases, from High Jump's actual public cargo, storage facilities associated with federal science agencies. The receiving custody line on all 11 of the clerk's forms was filled in with a designation he had never encountered before and did not recognize as belonging to any Navy department, research institution, or private contractor he had processed cargo for previously. He recorded the designation phonetically in his notebook, admitting he was unsure of the exact lettering since he had only glimpsed it upside down as Comda. R carried the completed forms away, but he was confident it began with a project-style code, rather than an institutional name, the kind of internal Navy or Joint Service Project designation used for classified logistics, rather than the name of any museum, university, or laboratory. He never saw the 11 crates again after they left the pier. He noted that a flatbed convoy, separate from the ordinary equipment trucks used for the bulk of High Jump's returning cargo, arrived specifically for those 11 case numbers, escorted by 2 vehicles the clerk described as not marked like anything I recognized, and not sailors driving them, not by their bearing. The convoy departed before the rest of that day's cargo had even finished being logged. VI. The press conference that never mentioned them. In the weeks following the fleet's return, Byrd gave several public statements to the press regarding the operation's early conclusion and its findings, some of which survive in newspaper archives from March 1947. In these statements, widely reported at the time, Byrd spoke in general terms about the value of the aerial mapping conducted, the harshness of conditions encountered, and, in remarks that drew brief but notable attention from several papers, a comment about the strategic importance of polar regions in the event of future conflict, in which unnamed hostile aircraft might be capable of operating between the poles at speeds that current defense systems could not intercept. This remark, made in the context of Cold War anxieties that were already reshaping American military planning in 1947, was reported plainly at the time as a statement about the strategic vulnerability of the Arctic and Antarctic approaches, and Byrd's own public explanations in the following years continued to frame his polar comments within that conventional strategic context. The 11 crates were never mentioned in any Navy press release, congressional record, or public accounting of High Jump's cargo. The operation's official narrative, as delivered to the public and to Congress, concerned mapping data, meteorological samples, and equipment testing results, all of which were processed and logged through entirely ordinary channels, by the clerk's own account, alongside hundreds of other unremarkable crates he inspected personally that same week. It is worth situating this single remark within the broader, well-documented pattern of Byrd's public statements growing more guarded, rather than less, as his career continued. Byrd was, by 1947, one of the most publicly celebrated explorers in American history, a man who had built his reputation on generous, detailed accounts of his expeditions for popular magazines and radio audiences. Yet in the years following High Jump, his public remarks about his polar work grew noticeably shorter and more general, a shift several biographers have noted without fully explaining. His later television appearance, aired once on the Longines Chronoscope program in 1954 before the broadcast tape was lost, has itself become a point of interest for researchers precisely because so little of what he said in it was ever quoted afterward in the press, despite the program's general practice of generating follow-up newspaper coverage for its guests. A separate interview, given to a Chilean newspaper in 1947 during a stopover related to his polar work, was never reprinted in any American publication, a gap that stands out given how closely the American press had otherwise tracked every public statement Byrd made about High Jump that same year. None of these later gaps prove by themselves anything about the 11 crates specifically, but they establish a documented pattern, a public figure whose willingness to discuss his own polar work narrowed sharply after 1947, in ways his own earlier career gives no indication he would have chosen voluntarily. Byrd had spent 2 decades cultivating exactly the kind of open, colourful public storytelling that made him famous. The sudden restraint, beginning in the same season the 11 crates crossed a Norfolk pier without inspection, is the kind of coincidence that historians are trained to treat cautiously, and that the Clerk's notebook, for its part, treats as anything but. 7. The part of the notebook he did not show his wife. According to the family who eventually possessed the notebook, its author kept it in a locked drawer for the remainder of his life, and told his wife only, decades later, and only once, that some of what came off those ships in 47 should never have come off at all, and I signed my name, to make sure it did anyway, and that is the part I cannot put down. The notebook's entries from the following months describe a period of what the Clerk called a very careful kind of watching, not surveillance in any dramatic sense, but a persistent, low-grade sense that his handling of the 11 crates had been noted somewhere, and that his continued employment depended on a certain incuriosity. He wrote that Comte Duras found reason to speak with him twice more in the following month, on each occasion asking, in the same friendly tone, whether he had any trouble remembering which forms went with which crates, a question the Clerk understood, correctly or not, as a test of his discretion rather than a genuine administrative inquiry. He was transferred, by his own account, to an unrelated logistics post at a different facility within 4 months, a transfer he had not requested, and which came with a modest increase in pay that he described, without elaboration, as enough to notice, and enough to make the moving easier to accept without asking why. The Clerk's notebook was not the only fragment to survive. In 1998, a regional historical society in Virginia, conducting an oral history project on Norfolk's naval logistics workforce, recorded an interview with a former dock worker, then in his 80s, who had worked cargo details at the Norfolk Naval Operating Base during the 1940s. Asked generally about memorable cargo during his service, the man, whose interview is preserved in the Historical Society's audio archive under a general High Jump era labour history heading, rather than any reference to the crate specifically, recalled, without prompting about any specific case number, a batch of crates that came off the ice ships in 47 that we weren't supposed to talk about, long ones, heavier than they looked, and men came for them that weren't Navy men, not the way we knew Navy men to carry themselves. He added that a joke had circulated briefly among the loading crew, comparing the long crate to a coffin, a detail he found funny at the time and uncomfortable to repeat decades later, and that the joke had stopped when a supervisor overheard it and told the men, plainly, to keep their observations to themselves if they wanted to keep working that pier. This account, independent of the Clerk's notebook and recorded by a researcher with no apparent knowledge of the notebook's existence, describes the same physical detail, the long, coffin-like crate, using the same unprompted comparison, more than 50 years apart, and from 2 people who, so far as researchers have been able to determine, never knew each other or had any means of coordinating their recollection. It is important, in an account built on private notebooks and oral history, rather than declassified Navy cargo manifests, to be precise about what can and cannot be verified through public record. The Navy's own historical materials on Operation High Jump confirm the early recall of the fleet, the scale of the operation, and Byrd's subsequent public statements regarding polar strategic vulnerability. What the public record does not provide is a complete itemized cargo manifest for every crate offloaded at every port during the fleet's return, a gap that is, by the standards of military logistics record-keeping, unusual for an operation of High Jump's publicized scale and cost, though it is also true that incomplete or since-lost paperwork from a 70-year-old military logistics operation is not, by itself, evidence of anything beyond ordinary archival attrition. What can be said plainly is this: a documented, procedurally irregular instruction was given to at least one civilian cargo clerk to log a specific block of crates without physical inspection, using a boilerplate description that conveyed no actual information, addressed to a receiving custody designation the clerk did not recognize as belonging to any known research institution, moved by a convoy that did not match the pattern used for the rest of that day's cargo. Whatever these 11 crates contained, someone with sufficient authority wanted a paper trail that existed on record, satisfying the requirement that cargo be logged, while ensuring that trail described nothing at all. Researchers who have attempted to reconcile the clerk's account with public Navy archives have run into a specific, recurring obstacle. Cargo logging records of this kind, for this period, were not permanently archived at the same institutional level as operational or scientific reports. Routine logistics paperwork, the individual case-by-case manifests generated at the point of unloading, was typically retained only for a fixed administrative period before being scheduled for destruction under standard records management policy, unless flagged for permanent retention due to some specific legal, financial, or historical designation. High Jump's scientific findings, aerial photography, and command-level after-action reports were retained and eventually made available to historians. The granular Clerk-level cargo manifests for the fleet's return were not treated the same way, and no complete set has surfaced in any public archive search conducted by researchers examining this account. This is, on its own, unremarkable. Military logistics paperwork from the 1940s at this level of granularity is lost far more often than it survives, for entirely mundane reasons having nothing to do with any specific event. What makes this particular gap notable is not its existence, but its convenient alignment with a specific, procedurally irregular instruction that a named witness, however imperfectly documented that witness's own identity remains, recorded at the time as unusual enough to privately copy into a notebook he kept locked for the rest of his life. Ordinary record loss does not typically require a lieutenant commander to stand at a clerk's table until 11 forms are completed a specific way. That detail belongs to the clerk's testimony, not to any administrative footnote. In the decades since High Jump's abrupt conclusion, various explanations have circulated for what the expedition may have encountered or recovered, ranging from the mundane, meteorite, or unusual geological samples requiring special handling procedures unrelated to any conspiracy, to the more elaborate claims that have attached themselves to Byrd's polar career generally, including alleged encounters with unexplained aerial phenomena, alleged discoveries of pre-existing structures or remains beneath the ice, and broader claims about hidden Antarctic history that circulate widely in alternative history communities, but which rest on evidence far thinner than what survives in this clerk's specific, procedurally grounded account. This account does not claim to know what the 11 crates contained. It presents what can be documented: an irregular procedure, an unrecognised custody designation, a physical detail, The long crate, independently recalled by two people with no connection to each other, and a public strategic statement from Byrd himself about hostile capability in the polar regions that, whatever its intended meaning, was delivered in the same season as a fleet recall whose full cargo accounting has never been made public. The gap between what the Navy said high jump was for and what actually left those 11 crates' point of embarkation blank on a customs form is the space in which this story sits, not as proof of any specific conclusion, but as a documented irregularity that has never been fully explained by an institution that has never been asked to explain it under oath. According to the family's account, the Clerk retired from Navy logistics work in the early 1970s and lived quietly for another 3 decades, rarely discussing his wartime and post-war service beyond general, uncontroversial recollections suitable for family gatherings. He mentioned the 11 crates, so far as his family could recall, only twice. Once to his wife, in the remark recorded above, and once near the end of his life to a grandson, telling him only that there are things a government will ask an honest man to sign his name to, and not tell him why. And the hardest part is that you do it anyway, because the alternative is worse for you and changes nothing for them. The notebook was found among his personal effects after his death, in the locked drawer his family had always known not to open while he was alive. It passed through an estate sale in 2004 to a private collector interested in post-war Americana, and was subsequently examined, transcribed in part, and discussed by a small number of independent researchers with interest in high jump era archival gaps, though it has never been authenticated by any professional archival institution, and no public agency has responded on record to inquiries referencing its contents. What remains, in the end, is not a revelation but a procedural fact that resists easy dismissal. 11 crates, logged without inspection, addressed to nowhere any institution could later confirm, carried away by men who did not move like sailors, on a pier where an ordinary clerk did his ordinary job, and, in doing it, left behind the only trace of something that everyone with the authority to explain it has, for more than 70 years, simply declined to discuss. The ships came home early, the ice officially had won, and somewhere in a records warehouse, or in a landfill, or in a drawer nobody has opened yet, 11 case numbers sit attached to a description that says nothing, signed by a man who knew it said nothing, and who carried the weight of that signature for the rest of his life. He wrote in the notebook's final entry, referencing the matter, dated some years after the events themselves. I have made my peace with not knowing what was in them. I have made less peace with knowing that I helped make sure nobody else would ever ask. There is a particular kind of history that never makes it into an official report, not because it is untrue, but because it was never anyone's job to write it down. Byrd's high jump is remembered, in most textbooks that mention it at all, as a footnote in the early Cold War, a large but unremarkable exercise in polar logistics, cut short by weather, notable mainly for its scale. That version of events is not false. It simply may not be complete, and the incompleteness, if it exists, would not have been recorded by admirals or historians. It would have been recorded, if anywhere, exactly the way this account found it. In the private notebook of a man whose entire professional function was to write down what came off a ship, and who was asked once to write down something that was not true, and did it anyway, because that is what an ordinary man in an ordinary job is asked to do when the alternative is a conversation nobody wants to have on a cold pier in February? The clerk was not a whistleblower. He never went to a newspaper. He never contacted a congressman. He completed his forms, took his transfer, accepted his modest raise, and lived out a long, quiet life in which this single afternoon remained the one thing he could never fully set down, even in a notebook meant for no one's eyes but his own. That perhaps is the detail that ought to sit longest with anyone considering this account. Not the shape of the crate, not the unrecognised custody designation, not even Byrd's own carefully worded remarks about polar vulnerability in the weeks that followed. It is the fact that the only complete record of what may have happened on that pier exists because one man could not quite bring himself to forget it, and could not quite bring himself to tell anyone else either. So he split the difference and wrote it down for no one, confident that no one would ever need to read it. Someone did. And so, more than 70 years after 11 crates left a Norfolk pier under an escort that did not move like sailors, addressed to a name that belonged to no institution anyone can identify, the question the clerk carried alone for the rest of his life is, for the first time, being asked out loud. What was actually inside them? Who decided the country would never officially know? And why, of everyone involved in Operation High Jump, it was left to one anonymous customs clerk, standing at a card table under a canvas tarp, to be the last man asked to sign his name to the answer?